And gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here. I just thought I would start off with a little visual of the sort of spirit of things we're going to be getting into here, because we have somebody who is Immanuel Kant aficionado of some kind. His name is William Vallicella, Gold Canyon, Arizona. His motto is study everything, joy in nothing. Omnia mea mi comporto. Rands' misunderstanding of Immanuel Kant. Okay. Now, we're going to go through this. Right down here, he says, trust me, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Kant. Well, we've been doing a little Kant. We know a little bit about him, don't we? Okay. For knowledge, two things are required: sensory input and conceptual interpretation, right? There are those categories inside the mind that are there before, and we go out and find reality, and reality has to fit those categories, and they match up. So if we can deduce the categories, then we know something about reality. We don't even have to go to reality. We can just deduce the categories, right? So we know about these things called categories. Since the interpretation is made in accordance with categories grounded in our understanding, the object of knowledge is a phenomenon rather than a noumenon, thing in itself. If it were a noumenon, it would just be a platonically divorced from us thing. But since we perceive it and conceive of it, it's a nomenon. It's a phenomenon. Because we perceive it and conceive of it, it is a phenomenon. Okay? Since phenomenon, now what is a phenomenon? A phenomenon means that it partakes of categories in your mind, and it exists in reality, and its nature is you perceiving it in reality and it being perceived and categorized by you. He has a word for that. The word of you perceiving and categorizing something by categories that were already in your mind before you ever went out to perceive that thing. He has a word for that. Okay? His word for that is phenomenon. So a phenomenon is objective reality, sense perception, as well as these categories in your mind. Now, the only problem an objectivist is going to have is, what the hell are these categories in your mind? What are you talking about? But let's just give Kant his categories. Let's say he's got categories in his mind, and he's got an object in reality, and he says that there's a link between them or some similarity between them, or you couldn't know about the object in reality if you didn't first have the category in his mind. That's his exact claim. Okay, so these phenomenon are objectively valid, or objects of objectively valid cognition. Now, what is objectively valid cognition? You are redefining objectively valid cognition here to mean cognition about arbitrarily made up nonsense and its relation to reality. Which means arbitrarily made up nonsense. Because if you can make up stuff, it doesn't matter what, you can pick and choose reality. The fact is you're making up nonsense. So, objectively valid cognition means, in this sentence, in this paragraph, objectively valid cognition means to arbitrarily define nonsense and then cogitate about it. Okay? I just want you to know, ladies and gentlemen, where we are going. That is his claim, that the term objectively valid cognition means to arbitrarily define phenomenon and interpret them as some interaction between the mind of reality and then the mind and reality, and then cogitate about that. Now, where did Kant get these categories that are the basis of this objectively valid cognition? Where does he get his categories from? Does he deduce them from reality? No, he says himself he does not. He says himself that he does not deduce them from reality. Okay? He gets them from the mind. He deduces them from pure reason. Okay? So, in this gentleman, this guy who I'm going to start calling a scumbag any second here, William Vallicella, defines objectively valid cognition as cogitating about arbitrary nonsense. Okay? There we are. Now, he says right up here at the beginning, Ayn Rand has some interesting things to say about the German philosopher Immanuel Kant in her essay Faith and Force, Destroyers of the Modern World. Here's one example, and here's a beautiful quote from Ayn Rand. Kant did not deny the validity of reason. He merely claimed that reason is limited and that it leads us to impossible contradictions. Now, she says impossible contradictions to strengthen her case against anybody who would say that there are other types of contradictions. And he puts in brackets, as opposed to possible contradictions? Well, sort of, just to strengthen her case against people who would say that, yes. So the answer to his bracket question there is kind of, yeah. Not really, she's not asserting there are possible contradictions. She's simply strengthening her case. Okay, so that everything we perceive is an illusion and that we can never perceive reality or things as they are, right? He did say that. He said we perceive things as the category in our mind dictates. And we don't know the thing in reality, we just know the way that we perceive the thing in reality. And that's dictated by the categories in our minds, right? That's what he said. Okay. He claimed, in effect, that the things we perceive are not real because we perceive them. Right. And like I've said, what would his method of perception be then if it were to be objective perception? It would be getting to things without there being a concrete instance of them, getting to the real it behind it, some floating thing in a vacuum that doesn't have any properties. So it's just floating Platonic nonsense when you ask them, okay, then what would constitute objective perception? It's just absolute nonsense. So they define their way out of the problem, and then they say that they can't find objective perception of reality. So that's Kant's game. Now, what does he say? Anyone who knows anything about Kant knows this is a travesty of Kant's actual views. Okay, so pretty rough there, pretty rough. He's pretty rough. It's either a willful distortion, no, it's actually a very good summation, or a distortion based on ignorance of Kant's texts. No, it came from reading Kant's texts, and one wonders if he has read Kant's texts, and since, ladies and gentlemen, you have read along Kant's text with me, we realize this is one of the guys who read along and said, oh, I'm very sophisticated, I'm very smart, I'm going to go along with everything Kant says. And every time Kant trolled him and said, some people would say that we have let ourselves into disaster and we look like utter fools. Every time Kant trolled him like that, he was like, yeah, but those guys are the real idiots, huh? Huh, Kant, me and you, we're buddies, huh? He's that guy. This is the guy who bought into every single one of Kant's nonsenses. And then every time Kant gave him an out and said, are you sure you don't want to jump off and be a thinker for yourself? Are you sure? Every time he was given an out, this guy said, no, Kant, I'm with you. I want to be with you. All right, so that's the kind of a scumbag guy who can't think for himself we're dealing with here. Okay, he says, first of all, notice how Rand runs together three separate ideas in one and the same sentence. All right, let's look at that first sentence quoted. All right, there are three separate ideas in there. Let's see if we can identify what the three separate ideas. He says, this is a sure sign of a sloppy thinker. Suppose we distinguish the Kantian claims. Now, maybe these are the three ideas down here, K1, K2, and K3. Reason is limited. When reason is employed without guidance, it contradicts itself. Knowledge requires sensory input and conceptual interpretation. Are those the three ideas? Let's see. Kant did not deny the validity of reason. He merely claimed reason's limited. So reason is limited in its cognitive employment to the sense world. So he merely claims it's limited, that it leads us to impossible contradictions. When reason is employed, reason without guidance, it contradicts itself, okay? And everything we perceive is an illusion. We can never perceive reality and things as they are. Right. We only perceive the categories. Okay. So she did say, she summed all three of those points up together in that sentence, and she did a good job of it. Now, first of all, notice how Rand runs together three separate ideas in the same sentence. Okay, so what claim is he making there? Just that she put different ideas into a sentence, but she did a very good job of it. I mean, she tied them up together. She said, he claims this about reason, about contradictions, and about perceptions of reality, right? Now, if she had tied them together in a sloppy way or said something about them that was only true of 2 instead of 3 or something like that, then I could see him complaining. What is he complaining about? So there he smears her as a sloppy thinker because she had three ideas in a single sentence. And they were well put together too. It was a very clear thought. I mean, they were all illustrations of the same thing. They all fit together. Now, so he apparently, I'm going to diagnose him as a disintegrated thinker. Even when he sees 3 ideas that are related together in a sentence, he says those are separate ideas. Why are they together in a sentence? Because he can't connect any 2 ideas, let alone 3. It has blown his hippie noodle, and he is now protesting that she's a sloppy thinker because she noticed similarities between 3 things in Kant's philosophy. All right, he says, suppose we distinguish the following claims. So let's take that sentence apart, do what he likes to do. Let's just look at these parts separately and not think about how they're connected and not worry about the connections. So the best way to do that is to put them in a list and not have any relation between them, not have a paragraph where it flows from one to the other, not have segues or anything, but let's disintegrate them and put them into a list. Okay. So the first idea he wants to talk about, reason is limited in its cognitive employment to the sense world. There's no knowledge by reason alone of metaphysical objects lying beyond the bounds of sense, such as God and the soul, right? So we have to design some other new form of reason that Immanuel Kant comes up with, but reason is not sufficient for it, okay? And God and the soul don't exist anyway, so he is talking about nonsense. All right, so what does he clarify by listing this out like that? Now, down here he says, this is an accurate summary of central Kantian theses. So he's just saying that he's setting these out accurate and that Ayn Rand hasn't. She claims that he did not deny the validity of reason. He claimed reason is limited. And he's saying reason is limited in its employment to the sense world. So he's saying the exact same thing she said. Why is his better? Because he lists it as one idea instead of with a comma after it, number 1 before it. What's different about this? What's he saying? Why is this different? Okay, number 2, when reason is employed without sensory guidance or sensory input in an attempt to know metaphysical objects, reason entangles itself in contradictions, right? So we have to develop pure reason, right? So we have to develop some new thing, and that's Kant's job, right? So reason needs sensory input. Kant is going to deal with categories, but he's going to do it with pure reason, right? A different thing without use of evidence. Okay, right? Kant did not deny everything that leads us to impossible contradictions. Everything we perceive is an illusion. We can never perceive reality as things that they are. Yeah, come to look at that sentence, there's 2 things in it, aren't there? There's that claim, and then there's that claim. So he is such a D-type, he can't even put 1 and 2 together, even though they are part of the same thing. Oh my goodness. See, this is a D2 type. Oh, he has had his coffee the day he wrote this, didn't he? He was really going. He even splits reason up into two different bits of reason. There's the cognitive employment of the sense world, and then there's employing it without sensory guidance or sensory input, which has nothing to do with cognitive employment to the sense world. And cognitive employment in the sense world has nothing to do with employing it without sensory guidance or sensory input. Those are two different points in his D-type mentality. Ayn Rand has three ideas in that sentence, where we see she actually has two. And there's two of the ideas, which are actually one. What a moron. Okay, he has a Ph.D.? Really? Okay. Now, we already did this one. He's trying to redefine objectively valid cognition. He says, for knowledge, two things are required: sensory input and conceptual interpretation. Since the interpretation is made in accordance with categories grounded in our understanding, right? There's already something in your mind. You're not tabula rasa. The object of knowledge is a phenomenon rather than a noumenon, a thing in itself. Now, that means that is subjective. It's part of the subject's interpretation or perception, right? Now, since phenomenon are objects of objectively valid cognition, see that word right there, since? There needs to be an operation before you put that word in there, buddy. You did not do any operations to bring that word forward. Since is a conclusion. Are you concluding that phenomenon are objects of objectively valid cognition? Right after you said that they're not, you said they're subjective, based on the person's understanding grounded in categories inside their mind. They do not know the thing in itself. They only know the thing as per their categories. So, that's a subjective. Phenomenon are subjective. Okay? Now, in what sense are they objects of objectively valid cognition? So this, if he's going to redefine right in front of your face with that word as his operation, since. Now, right in here, in this little space here that's empty, there should have been something that showed us why these phenomenon are objectively valid, are objects of objectively valid cognition, and not objects of subjective cognition, which is what he just defined them as in the previous sentence, having to do with our own understanding, each individual's perception. He says it's subjective, it's up to each of our own understanding, since these are objects of valid, objectively valid cognition. A phenomenon is distinct from an illusion. There's his conclusion. Okay. So if that doesn't follow, if as I say, this up here is a goddamn wreck, then this right here is not a solid conclusion. Phenomenon are distinct from illusions. That is not a solid conclusion, ladies and gentlemen. Phenomenon are not distinct from illusions. Phenomenon are equal to illusions. And we can tell that because of the absolute run-amok garbage that happened right up here. Okay, so phenomenon are illusions, okay? And if you want to know why that's the case, just ask Immanuel Kant. I'm not saying they are. Immanuel Kant says they are. Phenomenon are illusions, and phenomenon are not objects of objectively valid cognition. So, the thinking just in this little paragraph here is so twisted and so evil, it is disgusting. And the fact that he puts this as a point to clarify a sentence by Ayn Rand. What a pea-brained pygmy this guy is. Good God. Well, let us continue. This is an accurate summary of central Kantian theses. Trust me, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Kant. Well, we can take him, I don't know. We can take him, can't we? Oh boy. Comparing this summary with what Rand says, one can now see how she distorts Kant's views. There's no need to distort Kant's views. You just state Kant for what he himself says he was. And idiots think they're so smart that they're with Kant, can't see through it. That's the real problem. Okay. Not only does Rand misinterpret K1, 2, and 3, which we've just seen she doesn't, she conflates them in her run-on sentence, although they are obviously distinct. I'm just going to revisit her run-on sentence. Kant did not deny the validity of reason. He merely claimed that reason is limited, that it leads us to impossible contradictions, that everything we perceive is an illusion, and that we can never perceive reality or things as they are. So she just listed, he merely claimed, and then she listed 4 claims. That is not a run-on sentence. He has a Ph.D. and he calls that a run-on sentence. He did not deny the validity of reason, he merely claimed. Now that is the sentence right there. In what sense is that a run-on sentence? That's the sentence right there. The rest of this is a list of claims that Kant made. Okay? This guy has a Ph.D.? Are you kidding me? Did he get it from a box of Cracker Jacks? Oh my God, now where were we? This is an accurate summary of Kant. I got my dissertation. There's a little blank space in here that's missing. I got my degree from a box of Cracker Jacks. You forgot to put that in right here. Trust me, they were good Cracker Jacks. Comparing this summary with what Rand says, one can see how she distorts Kant's view. Not only does Rand misrepresent these, she conflates them in her run-on sentence. Particularly outrageous is Rand's claim that for Kant, objects of perception are illusory. Well, I think we just went over that pretty soundly, didn't we, ladies and gentlemen? His hippopotamus dance to the contrary notwithstanding, for Kant, objects of perception are illusions. Even though they went through all that nonsense to try to get out of it, the conclusion did not follow that he ended up with. And then he said, therefore, of this conclusion, therefore, and that just didn't work. Okay, given Kant's quite explicit explanation, where he says he has no evidence and he's not going to give evidence because he doesn't care because that's a lower, more common form of thinking. His explicit explanations, where he explains that he's not going to explain anything and you have to take him on faith. That's his explicit explanations, okay, of the distinction between appearance and illusion. How could he know about the distinction between appearance and illusion? Certainly not through evidence of the senses, which he is questioning. So he has to get this, Kant's whole discussion of this topic right here has to come from something other than sensory information, right? Which means non-sensory information, right? If you're not getting your arguments about this, because these are not necessarily, we're trying to justify these. Appearance and illusion. We're trying to justify appearance. You can't do it through appearances, can you? You have to do it through some other means. And Kant does it through formal logic and reason and whatever else, divorced from sense perception. In other words, the world of sensory things is not part of his argument. He only talks about the world of nonsense. It's Kant. Kant's the one who said it, not me. Don't blame me. Okay, what's more, Rand gives no evidence of understanding the problem with which Kant is grappling. Okay, he's right that Kant is grappling with the problem, but Rand understands it thoroughly and sidesteps it in a single sentence, which you can't even grasp. You thought it was a list. Okay, namely that of securing objective knowledge of nature in the teeth of human skepticism. Well, Kant sure failed at that, didn't he? By defining absolutely all knowledge as subjective, he secured objective human knowledge. That's really stupid. Kant said there is no knowledge of reality, there's only knowledge of things in our mind. Okay, how does that give us objective knowledge of nature? So You are a mess, buddy. You're a D2 type mess. You can't he can actually have ideas strung together in a sentence which contradict each other and not worry about it. He thinks that's a good sentence, and he thinks that Rand's beautifully constructed sentence up here is a run-on sentence. He doesn't even know what a run-on sentence means. Okay. One cannot evaluate a philosopher's theses except against the backdrop of the problems those theses are supposed to solve. Okay, so what is he saying there? I mean, we know what he actually just said there. He said blah, 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 and nonsense, right? But what he's trying to claim there is that we couldn't understand Immanuel Kant unless we accept Kant and sort of and give him credence or something like that. Like, you can't dismiss Kant out of hand and say everything he was doing was nonsense, because then you can't understand him. So in order to understand him, you have to accept his nonsense as true, or accept his nonsense as plausible, and investigate his nonsense, right? You come to a field of stuff and you say, Kant, after this claim right here, everything you're saying is arbitrary. You have no evidence beyond this claim. This all might as well be a made-up story or a poem about flowers. All of this stuff here is nonsense. So I dismiss it. And this fella comes along and says, no, you can't dismiss it. You have to accept his arbitrary claim and go through each of his little nonsense claims after that and accept and evaluate those on their own terms. Well, why? Why? They're not related to reality. Why should we? Because we can't evaluate a philosopher's theses except against the backdrop of the problems they are supposed to solve. So we can't do this, we should do this in order to be able to evaluate the philosopher's theses. You have to accept the arbitrary and step into a forest of the arbitrary and submit yourself to a litany of arbitrary. You can't judge it as a blanket. You can't dismiss any of it. You have to go through claim after claim after claim, thousands, millions of claims they will put in front of you, and you can't dismiss any of them. Or you will be stuck in a situation where you're unable to evaluate the philosopher, okay? So you have to go into a field of arbitrary nonsense and explore every single inch of this arbitrary nonsense, or else you will be unable to evaluate the philosopher. Now, if you believe that, then anyone who won't accept Immanuel Kant's nonsense and play with it and dance around and spend days and hours and years playing with this nonsense is a person who cannot be taken seriously as far as Kant goes. You have to take Kant seriously. You have to take his nonsense seriously. You have to play with it. You can't dismiss it. You can't judge it. Or else they will dismiss you. Now, this is a very dangerous trap they've gotten themselves into. They will not listen to or talk to anybody who doesn't take their philosopher seriously. And their philosopher is a bunch of floating gobbledygook nonsense. They have themselves in quite a pickle, the people who believe in Immanuel Kant, don't they? It is, as I describe it here, it is beginning to sound a bit like a cult or a religion. Now, if we take Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany to be any indication, they indeed are some kind of cult or religion, aren't they? Now, we are here to give you some idea of the pitiful level that Rand operates from. Well, ladies and gentlemen, my voice is giving out a little bit. I will have to take a break, refocus, and recontinue. So let's call this part 1. And we will recontinue on that word to give you some idea of the pitiful level Rand operates from. Now, I will just go see if there's such a thing as getting to the live event, seeing if there are comments, and I'll do a couple comments if you guys have said anything before I sign off. Hi, Greenish Blue. Let's see if there are comments. I'll do a couple. My internet connection sucks. I prefer bluish green. Kant, you just can't understand anything. Check your promises. All right. Very substantive, guys. All right. Good job. Not that you guys have to bring the substance. I'm here for that. All right. Continuing next time. Patronize me if you're not already there. Let's do this. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper out.